Well, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. My apologies. I seem to be having some internet connection issues. Bear with me 1 minute while I resolve those. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My apologies to all of you. I seem to be having some internet connection issues. I believe we're live now, and we'll be taking your questions shortly. Hello to everybody across the country. My name is Dan Balkaran. I'm an employment lawyer in Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm going to be answering your questions today with respect to all things employment law. I just need confirmation for 1 second that you can all hear me, because again, I seem to be having some internet connection issues. So I'm going to try to resolve these, and I will get back to you in 1 moment. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay. Hi, everybody. My sincere apologies for that. I've been having internet connectivity issues this morning. I don't know why. It looks like you all can hear me now. I'm getting questions in. Great. So fantastic. We'll try to go a little bit long today because we started about 5 minutes late. Again, my name is Dan Balkaran. I'm a labor and employment lawyer in British Columbia. I'm called to the bar in British Columbia, which I'll talk about in a second. Before we get started, as always, if you have further questions beyond what I cover today, please go to employmentlawyer.ca. You can email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca, and you can always call us at 1-855-821-5900. Okay, so before I jump into your questions, the last 3 or 4 of these that I've done with you all, almost every question has been about mandatory vaccine policies at work. Your employer is imposing a mandatory vaccine policy upon you, and many of you who are choosing not to get the vaccine have questions about how to handle that. Excuse me. As a really brief primer, I'm not going to be talking today about vaccine passports. That's outside of the scope of my expertise. I'm only going to be talking about if the questions we're fielding are have to do with vaccines, about mandatory vaccination policies in the workplace. In very, very brief, our position generally is that your employer cannot, if you've been doing your job to this point, absent throughout the pandemic, not having taken a vaccine, absent a mandate from the government, so like a provincial health order or something like that, which I'll get to later on today. Your employer cannot impose a mandatory vaccine policy upon you, but if it does it anyway, and you refuse, you're likely going to lose your job. And so the question then becomes, do you have severance rights after your job is terminated? And the answer is yes. In almost all cases, you will have severance rights. The question is, what are those rights? Because what determines your severance rights, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about that, is first what's in your employment contract, and then your age, your length of service, and then the position that you held. And so it's inherently individual, and the amount of your severance that you would have coming to could be large, it could be small, and so it's going to be uniquely tailored to each one of you. But in almost all cases, if your employer says, hey, get the vaccine, and you don't, and you've been working up to this point without the vaccine, you're going to have some sort of severance coming to you. But what I'm talking about today is mostly or at least from a rights perspective, is post-termination. I don't have any magic to stop your termination from occurring in the event that your employer mandates that you get a vaccine and then you choose not to get one. A couple topics before I jump into your questions, because I've been talking to a number of you throughout the last couple of weeks. So just a couple of things of note. If you work in a sector where the government has mandated that employees in that sector, and I have to be careful with my words here because I'm talking to everyone across Canada, as opposed to just British Columbia. But if the government has mandated that employees in that sector get a vaccine, then even though I said you'd have severance coming to you, in that case you would not, most likely, because if the employer is required by the government to say, hey, all employees in the sector have to get a vaccine, and then the employee doesn't get a vaccine, the contract has essentially been frustrated. Your employment contract, or the contract of employment between you and the employer, has essentially been frustrated, and all the terms and obligations under that contract, including severance, would just dissolve. And that's because a third, through no fault of either party, you're not able to fulfill your obligations under that contract, and that's because the government has mandated it. So be careful with that. Be careful with provincial health orders about that. I had spoken to someone in British Columbia. So in British Columbia, indoor places like restaurants, for example, or indoor events, all of the patrons are required to show proof of vaccination. But that health order does not apply to employees specifically, but some employers are interpreting it as such, and then holding their own employees to account to the provincial health order. So that's incorrect in British Columbia. It may be in different jurisdictions. I'm not familiar with all the provincial health orders and all the different jurisdictions. Just be aware of what the health orders say, and just know that if there's a provincial health order that says you have to get the vaccine to work in this particular sector, then you very likely don't have any severance rights at that point. So just be aware of what those health orders say. Let's see, a couple other things I wanted to mention. I had referred to, and I continue to refer to everyone that I talk to. For most of you, the solution that you want is an amicable one. You don't want to. I mean, yes, you can get severance rights. You can call someone like me to assist you in getting severance rights after you've been terminated. But for the vast majority of you, you'd prefer to keep your jobs. You'd prefer to not have your employment terminated. And so if you can, you want to achieve some sort of amicable solution. And to the employer requiring you to get a vaccine, usually that looks like, hey, I'm going to work from home. If you're able to work remotely, obviously not everyone is able to do that. Hey, I'm going to work from home, or I can do this with social distancing or something of that nature. But a lot of you won't be able to achieve these amicable solutions. And I think that when you're deciding what your strategy is, right? Because you have to, I think that everyone who's not going to get the vaccine should look at this as strategically as possible. You have to be aware of who your employer is. If your employer is a large employer that employs over 1,000 people, they're going to have almost, in my estimation, they're going to have almost no leeway to reach an amicable solution with just you, because they need to implement policies that work for that large amount of people. But if your employer is a sub 100 person employer, maybe it's a small, closely held corporation, maybe they have more scope to figure out some sort of amicable solution with you. So, and that's something to explore. But with a larger employer, maybe you don't even try and you look at different strategic options. Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. I'll jump into your messages. So Mitch says, hi, I work for the city. Can they fire me for cause for refusing the shot? Right now, I'm trying to fight the fact that I have a natural immunity from recovering from COVID. So if you work for the city, you're most likely going to be a member of a union, in which case you need to talk to your union representative about that to see if you can come up with some sort of solution that works for you. I will I will say one more thing that it's sort of tangential to it. Um, the mandates by employers that you get vaccines they're sort of a cultural phenomenon that is playing off of the political phenomenon, which is that the state is requiring huge swaths of its citizenry to get the vaccine through mandatory vaccine passports or something like that. So passports come into play, and then employers seem to be taking their cue from that, moving on. Those are cultural and political events that are right now, but they're not necessarily going to last forever. So there are developments in different countries around the world. For example, Singapore and Norway, I understand, have decided to get rid of all of their passports and their and don't quote me on this. I just heard it on a news source, but to get rid of their passports and lockdowns and so forth, and just live with COVID, I think is the phrase that they were using. And so these are just two small countries. Canada is a much bigger country. But my point is that the politics sometimes changes and probably will change in the future. And, for some of you, I had spoken to someone who was so upset about the mandatory vaccine policy that person went on stress leave, and their doctor said, you need to take some time off. It could be for some individuals who are forced onto stress leave by the stress of perhaps losing a long-term position where they wanted to be till they retired because they don't want to get a vaccine and they're being forced to take a vaccine. It could be that people like that stay on medical leave for a long period of time, and provided they can economically make that work. And during that period of time, maybe the underlying dynamics of the vaccine mandates from employers changes because the underlying culture and politics changes. So I'm not directing that as an option. I'm just saying for people in that situation, they could consider, how much time, if you buy time, maybe things change. But of course, that's just loaded with uncertainties, and it depends on your medical situation. But something to think about for everybody. Okay, can an employer force education session on vaccines onto their employees? Well, I don't really know what that means, other than they're gonna have a session with you that says, and I don't, your name isn't there, so I can't say who you are. I don't. Your employer is within reason and within your circumscribed employment rights. Your employer can ask you to do anything that's reasonable. And I think saying, hey, we're going to have an hour session trying to talk to you about the efficacy of the vaccines and why you should get it, I think that's fine. I don't think that you have any legal right to dispute that. Next one, how can an employer force a vaccination on an employee as new terms of employment if you have a collective agreement? Okay, union question. You should talk to your union representative. I will say generally for non-union employees who are not subject to a collective bargaining agreement, if you're starting at a new job, and this is going to be like with everyone who signs an employment contract, I shouldn't say everyone, I don't want to generalize, but for people who are starting at new positions, I suspect that most employment contracts are going to contain language about vaccines and COVID policies, and you can choose to agree to it or not to agree to it. And of course, if you don't agree to it, then you to be bound by those policies, you won't have a job most likely. So, it's not just your existing. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's not just your existing employment. If you refuse to get the vaccine, it's not just your existing employment that's at stake. You have to think about, well, what happens after I lose my job with trying to get a new job, because a lot of places are going to have COVID policies in their employment contracts going forward. And of course, if you don't agree to those, then you're not going to get the job. So food for thought, something to think about. Nadine, is it legal in Alberta for a company to make employees pay for rapid testing if it's not stated in their contract? So I talked about this in previous sessions, so you may want to Google my name and take a look. But rapid testing is an interesting one, right? So if a company says we're going to force you to get the vaccine, And but if you don't get the vaccine, you can instead have rapid testing once a week. And then that's still an imposition of a new term that was not required of you prior to the time that rapid testing policy was implemented. So theoretically, if you refuse to get it and your employer terminated you, theoretically that they couldn't. It's not a just cause termination, and therefore you'd be entitled to severance. However, I think it's much riskier because I can see a judge saying, you know what, company, we get it. A vaccine is an invasion of your health and privacy to an extent, and therefore, it was, I'm not going to uphold a just cause termination because you refused the vaccine, but they provided you a reasonable alternative, which was to get mandatory testing. I know that wasn't quite your question. So I think that if you were to refuse the mandatory testing, I think you would be on shakier ground with respect to could you get severance in the event of your termination. Now, if your goal is to keep your job, you're going to want to get the testing, because if you refuse the vaccine and you refuse the testing, you're going to be out most likely. So, but the question is who pays for it. Now, if you refuse to get the testing and because the employer won't pay for it, could you lose your job anyway? I think it's possible. Is it legal for the company to make employees pay for rapid testing if it's not stated in their contract? I don't know each province is different with respect to accommodation as defined within your own employment standards. I guess in your case, it's the Employment Standards Code, but the various Employment Standards Acts, they're in different provinces. I know in BC, I was talking about this morning, in BC, the companies are going to have to pay for it pursuant to the BC Employment Standards Act. In Alberta, I don't really answer that question. I'm sorry. If you shoot us an email to, again, help@employmentlawyer.ca, we can get the right person to take a look at that out of our Alberta office. But again, it comes down to, what is it you want, right? Like, I encourage you all to think strategically about cause and effect. If you take a stand on, because rapid testing, the cost has come down. Like, it used to be $100 a test, so that's $400 a month. It gets really expensive, but it for each of you. But the costs, I think, have come down to $20, $30 a month or even less. And so, if they're making you pay for it and you refuse to get them and they fire you, are you in a better situation? So then let me rephrase that. What is the outcome for you that you want, right? And if the outcome you want is to preserve your job, and maybe you can figure out something amicable with the employee or with the employer. So, okay, Will is asking, if I'm told not to go to work because I'm not vaccinated and wait for HR to contact me, is this a constructive dismissal? Yes. So yes, it probably is a constructive dismissal. So it depends, again, on your sector, if there are any provincial health orders that say you have to get vaccinated. But the core of even if you haven't signed an employment contract, like a piece of paper that outlines the terms of your employment, every one of you who's got a job still is working under a contract of employment with the employer. And the core of that contract of employment is you go to work for a certain amount of hours for a certain amount of pay to do a certain amount of duties. And so for the vast majority of you, some contracts will contemplate suspension and layoff, but for the vast majority of you, the employer has no right to just say, you know what, we're suspending your pay, because that violates the contract of employment, and therefore you've been constructively dismissed, because they have no right to stop paying you under your contract of employment, and therefore you'd be entitled to severance. Now, whether or not that's worth it for you depends on what your employment contract says, and excuse me for a second, what your employment contract says, and a variety of other factors that I discussed before. If you have 2 weeks coming to you, maybe it's not a stand you want to take. But on the other hand, if you have 12 months coming to you, maybe it is a stand you want to take. So, the core of your question, have you been constructively dismissed because you're not vaccinated? Probably. And I would certainly encourage you to contact us again at help@employmentlawyer.ca and 1-855-821-5900 to find out what your legal position is, and then how to capitalize on that legal position. Okay. Excuse me a sec. Does mandated vaccination override our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution? If so, how is this possible? Okay, so I've talked about in other episodes that the legality of the various vaccine passports is not something I have the expertise to comment on. I'm not a constitutional law lawyer. There are various charter challenges underway, I think, in most provinces with respect to those vaccine passports, and I expect that those cases to eventually make their way to Supreme Court of Canada, because it's obviously a very serious and prominent issue in Canadian law right now. With respect to your business, your place of employment, with the exception of government employers or employers that get funding in some cases from the government, the charter doesn't apply to you because it's a private entity. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies only to the government, and protects you from invasion of your rights by the government, not from private entities like your employer. Are truck drivers mandated by the government to get the vaccine? I know that certain federal employers are required. I believe the federal government has said that federal employers are required to be vaccinated. In terms of the most truck drivers in the province, it's an interprovincial trucking company, you're going to be federally regulated. But I'm not sure of that question. If you send me an email or email help@employmentlawyer.ca, we'll follow up on that and find out. But I don't want to give you an answer either way on that particular question. I wish I could be of more help there to you. Michelle asks, I've been on medical leave for 1.5 years and submitted my accommodation plan to my employer. My doctor and I thought they were reasonable. What are my options? Do I resubmit a revised accommodation plan at a later time? From a legal standpoint, what are my options? So I'm missing from your question. So first of all, this is not a vaccine question. So it's the first one I've had in 4 sessions here. Yes, your plan might be reasonable. Missing from your question is whether or not they rejected it or provided you, on the basis that they rejected it and so forth. Your employer is required to accommodate you, and in the event that it's not, then you technically have been terminated, and your human rights have been violated, and you would have a human rights complaint through your applicable provincial, depending on your whether or not you're provincially or federally regulated. You'd have a human rights complaint through either your provincial human rights tribunal, or if you're federally regulated, through the Canada Human Rights Commission. Michelle, you should absolutely give us a call or email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca. You 100% have a legal position if the accommodations provided by your doctor, if your doctor has said, look, I want you to gradually return to work, or I'm clearing you to gradually return to work, and here's the terms I think that can occur under. And if your employer says, no, I'm only allowing you to come back to work if you're 100%, well, it's required to accommodate you to the point of undue hardship by the various human rights legislations that are in place across the country. And so it's very likely you potentially have severance or some sort of option. I don't know what and as I always say to you guys, you got to figure out what is it that you want, right? So if Michelle, you want to just go back to work, and that's your best, that's really what your overriding goal is, then maybe getting a lawyer involved isn't necessarily the best thing. I mean, let me rephrase that. You should definitely talk to us, find out what your legal options are, and see if we can come up with a solution that works for you. Which, if it's severance based, it's severance based. If it's to try to see if we can get you back into your workplace, maybe it's that. So I hope I answered your question, Michelle, but absolutely contact us. Vicky, do you represent in any province? So my law firm, Samfiru Tumarkin, has offices in, and I don't want to get this wrong here, but I think it's Ontario, Alberta, and Vancouver. Now, British Columbia. Employment law is inherently jurisdictional. There's a lot of overlap. That's why I'm able to talk to you across the country. There's a lot of overlap between employment law in different provinces, but we're in those provinces, so we can assist you if we're in those provinces. I myself am only called in British Columbia, so I can only assist you if if I'm called in British Columbia. And actually, someone asked me this week if I could get involved with their matter in Ontario with respect to employer mandated vaccines. I could not, because I don't have any. I'm not called to the bar in Ontario, so I couldn't be of assistance, and it would have been counterproductive for me to get involved. However, I will just one comment on that point. What the person was asking me to do was because she was going to lose her job because she refused to get the vaccine, and she wanted me to write a letter to her employer, essentially threatening them with the potential severance she'd go after in order for them to reverse their position with respect to the mandatory vaccine with her. And I'm generally of the opinion, it's in not all cases, but if a lawyer is getting involved, if an employer gets a letter from a lawyer, particularly if that letter it contains threats, your employment is done. It's not going to continue. The employer is just going to say, like, get this person out of here. And so when at some point, I don't care what it costs. And so not always, but when I say amicable solution, I to stay, generally, I mean, have a chat with your employer and see if you guys can figure something out based on the goodwill that your employer has towards you, hopefully at that point. So that's what I mean by that. I mean, in some cases, maybe getting one of the lawyers here to write a letter for you to your employer may be of assistance, but to help you keep your job. But generally, we come in after everything is broken and try to get you money, generally. Derek, in Ontario, where a company has mandated vaccines or multiple rapid tests per week, is it legal for you to have to pay for this mandated rapid testing they are offering? We talked about this a little bit earlier. I suspect not. I suspect the Employment Standards Act requires the company to pay for the rapid testing. Again, it's a business expense. I can see why employers are foisting that off, or trying to foist that off, particularly large ones, on employees. It comes down to, if you refuse to pay it and therefore you refuse to get the testing, will you end up being terminated and losing your job? And is that an outcome you can stomach? It may be that the best solution for you at this point would be to pay for the tests for now and see if you can draw your employer's attention to the fact that it's required to pay for the tests, and see if you can figure something out down the road or in the next few months with it, where it's paying for the tests rather than you lose your job right out of the gate, which is probably what would happen. But no, I think probably in Ontario, the employer is required to pay for the vaccine. It's just, you got to think about what happens if you don't, and then you don't get the vaccine, the testing, and then you don't get the testing. Emma, I was fired for not taking the jab. Can I get unemployment? Well, if you were fired for not getting the vaccine, you should definitely email us again, help@employmentlawyer.ca. Call us 1-855-821-5900. See if you've got a severance position. Can you get unemployment? I would think so. I mean, you're only going to not get, and I'm not an expert on EIs, Service Canada's positions with respect to who gets EI and who doesn't, but they generally don't give EI out to people who are terminated for just cause. I think it's, as I've talked about over the last few sessions and today, I think it's a reach to say, by refusing, it's beyond a reach, but to say that by refusing to get the vaccine when you've been working without the vaccine up until the point of your termination, that your employer could have had just cause to terminate your employment. Okay, I work for a large national airline and I'm unionized. I don't want to disclose my status. Even if I do vaccinate, I refuse to compromise. You got cut off there, Richard, on the rest of it. You need to talk to your union rep and see what options are available to you, because it's always with the union going to be unique to what your collective bargaining agreement. So talk to your union rep. Tara, I've been off work since 2019. My doctor is allowing me to return to work, but HR says they can't at this time due to my restrictions. I presume your health restrictions. I also asked if there's anything I could do, and said no open positions. My work note says I can return to work, and they say no. What's my next step? You've been there for over 10 years. Okay, so if your doctor is saying you can return to work, let's just say you're at 70% or 50% of your previous capacity, and your doctor's saying, yeah, you can return to work on a gradual basis. and your employer says, we only want you at 100%, well, your employer is in violation of the law. You are entitled to, they have to accommodate you to the point of undue hardship. So unless it's an undue hardship to accommodate you, which is a very high bar for them to meet, it's very likely that by refusing to allow you to come back to work, they've essentially terminated your employment and violated your human rights. You definitely should talk to us, especially because you have 10 years there. I don't know what your employment contract says, but you should, and I don't know what jurisdiction you're in, what province, but definitely call us 1-855-821-5900, help at employmentlawyer.ca. You need to know what your severance rights are. And I would do that fairly quickly, Tara, because, they're refusing to I shouldn't say fairly quickly, you've got a little bit of time, but they're refusing to allow you to come back to work when your doctor has cleared you. So, this is a question about the vaccines themselves. Since we're technically still in the trial phase, can we argue that we are waiting for the trials and gain more information before making a decision to vaccine? No, the answer is, again, you're all talking about, we're talking about here in this situation about your employer mandating vaccines upon you. And there's a set of government accepted and cleared. I can't remember if I assume they're actually they're approved by Health Canada now. So no, I don't think that argument has any traction whatsoever. Michelle, when it comes to severance, does your maternity leave count toward years you have worked for the company? That's a great question. I would say yes. I would say that you're there for a certain amount of time and you're on leave. It's like any medical leave, right? If you're on leave, it still counts towards your length of service, if that's what you mean. Rita, if I serve a notice of liability, is that enough, or do I need to get a lawyer involved? I don't know what that means, Rita. I'm sorry, I don't know what your question is, and I don't know what a notice of liability is. Rita, again, how long can an employer keep you on unpaid leave? Okay, so that's fictional, but Rita works in long-term care. So in a lot of provinces, there are mandates from the government that long-term care workers yeah, how long can you be? That might be the best solution for you, because there's a mandate by the government saying you have to. If there's a mandate from the government in your province, so provincial health order saying that you have to uh, that you have to get vaccinated. If you're not on the leave, you would end up being terminated. And so being on unpaid leave might be the best bet for you, and maybe you can explore whether or not you can get some sort of EI funding, although I think that would be really tough in your situation. But for again, if there's an if there's a government mandate in your sector saying you have to get the vaccine, your legal rights are essentially zero at that point. So I think we're out of time. I apologize greatly to all of you for the internet connectivity issues that I've been having. I will be back in 2 weeks. We'll be having one, I'm sure, coming up this week. And so it won't be with me. It'll be with a different lawyer from my firm. But please join us for that. Again, employmentlawyer.ca. See on the website on the screen right now. Email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca and call us at 1-855-821-5900. I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Again, my name is Dan Balkaran. And thank you all very, very much for joining us.